What do you hear when you're underwater? Do you ever hear anything? If you asked me a few days ago, I'd tell you nothing really. Maybe the sounds of any nearby swimmers, any boats in the water, stuff like that. Definitely wouldn't have told you I could hear someone talking to me below the water. I'm not crazy though, I promise. Just let me explain. My girlfriend and I are staying at a cottage on a lake for a holiday. It's your standard run-of-the-mill vacation house. Nice view, easy water access, mildewy basement, nothing out of the ordinary. The lake we're staying on is beautiful. It's got a nice beach, clear water, even a little dock where people launch their boats. We got here a few days ago and we haven't had any notable happenings, just a relaxing couple of days swimming and grilling. I think there's something different about swimming at night though. I didn't end up swimming the first night we were here. I was too tired from all the day's activities and just fell asleep on the couch. The second night though, we had an early dinner and we were just sitting around until we were tired enough to go to sleep when I decided to go for a swim. My girlfriend won't go swimming after dark. She won't swim if she can't see her feet. Doesn't matter if it's cloudy water or it's just dark, so it was just me out there, alone, floating on the lake. Swimming at night is a special feeling. Your body just disappears in the black water and you feel weightless, like you're swimming through deep space. At least I do anyway. So I swam out to where I couldn't touch, put my belly up to the stars, and relaxed. As I lay there, enjoying how much of the stars I could see, I suddenly heard what sounded like a boat engine. I sat up and looked around, surprised that anyone else was out this late, but it was just me on the lake. And it was dead quiet too. I wasn't really sure what to make of it, but I decided that I might as well float a little longer. As soon as my ears were underwater again, I heard the motor. A low, loud rumble played in my ears, much closer than should have been possible given the stillness of the water. I brought my head up again and checked the lake. Nothing. There was no boat, no people, nothing but my own ripples from treading water. That was enough for me. I figured maybe it was the sound of the spring that fed the lake or something like that, but I also didn't really want to stay out there and figure it out. So I started swimming back towards the shore. I swam a little bit while consciously keeping my head out of the water before muscle memory kicked in and I dunked my head in to swim a little faster. That's when I heard it, or didn't hear it to be more accurate. There was no rumble, no motor noise. It was silent beneath the water. At least for a few seconds, until I heard, "Where are you going?" Clear as day, it sounded deep like the churning of a motor, as if someone was right beside me. I kicked into overdrive and swam faster than I ever have before to get back to the shore. I'm back inside now and my girlfriend's asleep, but I feel like I'm losing my mind. Underwater microphone picks up voices. I couldn't have known there were voices when my hydrophone first recorded the sound. My best guess was a bowhead whale, although the pitch didn't fluctuate or go nearly as high as the typical bowhead. This sound was sonorous and powerful, a seemingly sourceless echo reverberating through the ocean depths for at least a dozen miles around my ship. My name is Alyssa Williams, and I'm a marine biologist studying the effect of global warming on hourglass dolphins and other Arctic mammals. Hydrophone recordings are an essential tool in calculating the density and diversity of ocean life, although this is the first time I've heard something like this in the past 2 weeks I've been at sea. We like to think these expeditions give us a pretty good idea of what's going on down there, but it's really more like scooping a bucket full of water from the ocean and concluding whales don't exist because they didn't fit in the bucket. There are plenty of unexplained phenomenon and outlier data points, and most of the time we just have to ignore them so they don't contaminate the rest of our data. It was only chance which kept me from ignoring this sound altogether. My son is an electronic music artist, which I'm pretty sure is the same as a DJ, and he asked me to send him marine recordings to sample into his music. Every week I pick out a few interesting noises to send to him, and lacking anything else to do with this mysterious echo, I included it in the last batch. A couple of days later, I get an email back. He's been playing around with the sound, and after speeding it up, he noticed it started to sound like voices. He thought I was playing a prank on him, and I thought he was the one trying to fool me. It wasn't hard to prove though. As soon as I sped up the tapes, I began to hear it too. It was speaking in Spanish, at least at first. It kept switching every other sentence or so, mostly to things that sounded like language, but not one I recognized. I kept pausing the tapes until I was fairly confident I had a few words right. Afrikaans and Undabella were beginning to pop up regularly. Then about 10 minutes into the tape came this in English. I know you're listening. I'm listening to you too. The languages and dialects were consistent with Chile and South Africa, two of the closest countries to the north shore of Antarctica, where my vessel was located. I sat on my bunk, playing the tapes over and over, editing and re-editing just to make sure I had the original tracks. I kept telling myself it was a practical joke of some kind, but I couldn't figure out how the prankster could have known I was going to speed up the tapes. I should have told the rest of my crew about it, but I was terrified about looking like an idiot for having missed some obvious explanation. I decided to wait until I'd collected a bit more proof instead. I barely slept that night, mind spinning with the possibilities. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, but around 2 AM, the gentle lull of the boat seemed to change. I didn't exactly hear the sound, but I could feel it. The reverberations in the ship sinking into my bones, teasing me, beckoning me. I was getting pretty tired and angry at this point, but I wasn't the only one. "Turn the damn engine off," someone yelled. "What the hell, man? It's going to ruin my recordings and chase everything away." So that's what I'd felt. I forced myself to take a deep breath and close my eyes again. "It was never on. Go back to sleep, blockhead," our captain replied. The vibrations were only getting stronger. I sat up and stared out the porthole at the vastness of the black ocean. My mind was a carefully regulated numbness, afraid to let any thought in for fear of where they would race from there. Then the shouting began, and it was replaced with a different kind of numb. Blind panic. "How do we get off course? Where the hell are we? We haven't moved, check the GPS. But that wasn't there last night, what is it?" I flew out of bed, already fully clothed because of the freezing temperatures. A dark rolling wave passed by the porthole, completely out of sync with the rest of them. Everyone was waking up now, all clambering to get on deck to see what was going on. I went for my laptop instead, going straight to the folder with the new recordings. The deep moaning call was deafening, maxing out my speakers. It was much, much closer now. My fingers were shaking as I imported the audio into an editor, then sped up the track. My foot was tapping a river dance all by itself. I needed to see what everyone else was seeing, but I was the only one who knew to listen. More shouts meanwhile. "Iceberg clock. That's the one you were walking on yesterday, right?" "Yeah, me and David." "You labeled it as a dry dock type, right?" "It was a dry dock yesterday." "Absolutely. David went all the way down to the channel." "So why does it look like a pinnacle now? Look at the waterline. The whole damn thing is rising." Spanish from the recording. I kept scrubbing through, picking up a few isolated English words as I went. Frozen, thawed, hungry. Those stood out from the random scattered words. "Turn on the engine now," I screamed. There was a lot of shouting above the deck. I couldn't make sense of it. I bolted up the stairs just in time to see. That's not an ice pinnacle. It's a goddamn fin. At least 20 feet high, sinus webbing connecting the long, bony spurs which continued to rise out of the water. The captain was finally back behind the wheel, and the engine roared to life. A swelling wave lifted the whole ship at least a dozen feet in the air, hurling us back down at a nearly 45-degree angle. The impetus combined with our acceleration to launch us away at a reckless pace, hurling everyone and everything that wasn't tied down. The whole iceberg we'd been stationed next to had vanished behind us. That was 4 hours ago, and we haven't slowed down yet. No one has spotted the fin again, but it must still be below us because the hydrophone is blasting that sonorous echo. We won't make any official announcement to the scientific community until we've had a chance to analyze the rest of the tapes, but I need someone out there to know what happened, just in case we don't make it back. When I was a deep sea diver, I heard something terrifying beneath the ocean floor while investigating an oil rig. My name is Peter Wesker. I'm a marine biologist and a retired deep sea diver. Now I know this will sound unusual, but I have a story to tell you and you need to read it. Nobody else will. Nobody else wants to believe me, not even those that saw it firsthand. In 2007, while working for a small deep-sea salvaging corporation, my crew and I discovered something beneath an oil rig. What was it, you ask? We don't know, nor do we want to know. But you might. In our field, we're often hired by local authorities, and sometimes even international ones, to help with missing person cases, and even potential murders on occasion. A few weeks ago, I forwarded a transcript request to one of my colleagues, hoping they still had enough pull in the business to net me the information I needed. Reluctantly, they agreed on the terms that I don't contact them beyond that point. After waiting relentlessly for half a month, a beige envelope arrived on my doorstep this morning. It contained a yellow piece of paper with bold black writing. Here's what it said. I urge you to read carefully. December 18th, 2007. Captain Redacted. On December 9th, 2007, Singaporean citizen Yi Wei, age 34, affiliation Arabian Drilling, family NA, went missing while working as a maintenance officer on an offshore oil rig. Due to the nature of the disappearance and that he was not found aboard the rig, Wei was presumed dead with cause unknown. With suspicion of foul play after the report was put through by a co-worker, the Singaporean government hired Redacted to assist in locating the body if it was still present beneath the rig. In cooperation with the Singaporean government, Redacted deployed 3 divers to the offshore jack-up rig, Arab Drill 70, design designation Keppel FELS, KFELS B class. The rig was operating at a depth of 400 feet, more than what the team would usually work with, but not beyond their capabilities. The drilling depth of the rig was 30,000 feet. Team 3, designation T3, deployed on December 12th after arriving in Singapore. Standard procedures were conducted without error or issue. One of the divers who went missing was later confirmed to have been untrained at depths beyond 300 feet, which may have contributed to their potential fatality. After deployment, the team scoured the ocean floor around the drilling rig and made several reports to their topside surface team, Team 2, designation T2, via a low-frequency radio. The team reported noises coming from the ocean floor, but became anxious and had trouble describing the sounds. Topside gave the order to continue the investigation under the assumption the noises were caused by the drilling mechanisms beneath the sand and rock. Team 3 continued with the task of locating any remains and any potential signs of foul play. One of the co-workers suggested a weight may have been tied to Wei's legs, but the proposal was dismissed as baseless conjecture. 30 minutes into the dive, Team 3 resumed their reports of noises coming from the ocean floor, increasing in amplification as time went on. Team 3 made a request to be immediately extracted from the water. Topside began preparations for decompression and organized surfacing procedures. Reports from both teams vary at this point, and neither scenario has been confirmed. Senior diver Davis, one of the divers from Team 3, reported that the noises were still intensifying and the vibrations became physically distressing. Radio contact was lost within 30 to 40 seconds of the report. Topside became concerned that the rookie diver Keller would attempt to surface prior to decompression and run the risk of hypoxia. Team 2 continued to obtain radio contact with the submerged divers, but instead resorted to deploying an auxiliary diving assistant to continue with the decompression procedure. Divers Redacted and Redacted both reached the decompression chamber, and data expunged, error 543729, unauthorized data access, connection terminated. That was it. That was how it ended. I tipped my coffee into the sink and immediately grabbed the document and began transcribing it to my desktop, just in case. I was determined to put together the rest of the story. If the report wouldn't say what had to be said, I would. And this is why I'm writing to you now. The report was fairly accurate, I admit. Yi Wei was confirmed missing on December 9th, but nobody really knew if it was foul play, an accident, or something else. The company I worked with often did pretty standard salvage procedures. Cars that had fallen into a lake, sunken vessels, and even derelict boats to be detonated. But like I mentioned before, we also often worked with local and sometimes international governments on legal cases, hence why we were helping with a potential murder case. You already know a lot of the story, so I'll cut to the part you probably want to hear. We were underwater at a pretty ridiculous depth. To put it into perspective, Everest reaches 29,035 feet. This drill, just beneath the surface, would go on for another 30,000 feet on top of the 400 feet between the sand and the water's surface. We were right down at the ocean floor. You never really get used to the sensation of being at such incredible depths. Having an endless abyss of darkness all around you, knowing you can't swim to the surface because if you do, you'll probably die on the way. There's such a heavy feeling of reliance on the surface team to get you out of there that you begin to feel a little helpless. The noise didn't help. We were searching around the metal supports of the oil rig's structure, basically 4 massive pylons thrust into the ocean floor to hold the surface platform up. It was ridiculously daunting and large under the water, with rust caked all over the surface of the metal and more algae than I thought I'd ever see. A couple schools of fish circled us as we scoured the place from, well, bottom to bottom. That was when the noise began. It was subtle at first, and it wasn't just one sound. It was like a mix between a roller door opening and a mesh sliding door opening and closing loudly, but at the same time so distant and quiet. But it didn't go away. T32, Mike, do you hear that? I remember asking to my co-diver, Mike Davis. I was using my flashlight to search the sand for any source, but the visibility was so poor I could barely see 50 feet ahead. It still sounded incredibly distant, like it was far, far beneath the surface. The drill? Keller, our rookie diver, asked. Not a chance. There's at least another 30k feet down below us. I continued scouring the floor, but the sound started to grow louder, and yet the volume remained the same. It was growing closer. Radio topside, this thing's giving me the jeebs. I proceeded to oblige and radio in to our surface team that there was an unconfirmed noise originating from beneath the surface. After a little while, they gave the order to continue the search. Reluctantly, we did, until the noise grew again, and again, and again. It had slowly turned from 2 separate little sounds to a single loud noise, like an air raid siren screeching at us from below the depths. It continued to rise closer and closer, and we could feel the ocean floor shaking. What the hell? Call the surface, Wesker. I cursed and made the call to ready the decompression chamber. We were leaving then and there, whether they agreed to it or not. The noise continued to roar towards us, and the sand was shifting with its vibrations. My first thought was that the drill beneath the surface had broken and was coming up towards us, but it didn't take me long to disregard that as utter nonsense. Every option, every potential ripped through my mind as we swam upwards as far as we safely could, while waiting for the diving bell to be delayed. The noise grew closer and closer until I was certain it was about to burst straight out of the sand. Okay, that's as high as we can go, stop here, I shouted to my 2 co-divers, knowing this was the limit before hypoxia could set in. I calculated that on instinct, but checked my depth meter to confirm. Are you kidding? Whatever the hell that is isn't something I'm going to stick around to meet. If you try and surface, you know exactly what will happen. The noise was just below the surface, its rising and falling blood-curdling screech making my stomach drop. I checked my sub to surface ratio for replies, but static was the only noise coming through. They should have deployed the bell and confirmed by that point. Our inter-team comms were still operational though. "I'll take my chances," Keller shouted over the radio. I cursed again, but the noise drowned out any sound I had. It was so close I could practically reach out and touch the sound, its vibrations tearing through the water and sending ripples upwards, outwards, in all directions. I saw the silhouette of a diver resuming his stroke upwards before I shut my eyes as my head throbbed from the sound. It was only at that point that I realized I couldn't even hear Davis talking anymore. Eventually, I must have blacked out. When I awoke, I was topside, being assessed by the auxiliary diver after decompression. In my hazy confusion, I never found out if Keller or Davis survived. Nothing significant happened from there, except a stern talking to from our dive commander. I was to never speak of this again to anyone, or consequences would be dire. That was it. That was my anticlimactic conclusion. Whatever happened while we were out cold, whatever they found down there had to be in the rest of that report. No matter the cost, I need to find out. There was ocean water in the swimming pool. This story is told from the perspective of a woman. Even in the pool water and the sweltering heat, her lips remained a vibrant red. I knew it was creepy to watch my neighbor swimming, but I just didn't know how to talk to her. She climbed up on the side of the pool for a rest, singing something sweet but muffled as she combed her fingers through her hair. I didn't even know if she was into girls or not. With a creak, I pushed the window open to hear her singing. "It's a fine day." I couldn't quite make out all the words. Her eyes caught mine and I leapt back from the window. She must have seen me. My heart pounded painfully in my chest. In a moment of bravery, or maybe just panic, I decided that talking to her was the only way to redeem myself. Just a pep talk later, I found myself hiding behind the fence and trying to think of something to say. Finally, I decided that I would ask her about her waterproof makeup. Or maybe not, that might sound weird. Frustrated, I decided to just pop my head over the fence and say the first thing that came to mind. I soon found that the fence was higher than I had anticipated. With my face scrunched between two bedposts, I said the first thing that came to mind, maybe a little louder than necessary. "Hey, I like the day out." What I meant to say was either "I like your makeup" or "beautiful day out." However, my indecision led to that mess. I was ready to run back inside and never come out again, but then she laughed. It sounded like music. "I like the day out too," she said. I could feel the blood rush to my ears. She must have noticed I was blushing. "Do you want to come hang out in the pool?" Not wanting to say something embarrassing, I nodded energetically, which was probably a lot worse. Then I dashed inside to get my swimsuit. When I walked around to her yard, she was nowhere to be found. "Don't go in the pool yet, I'm getting drinks," she yelled from inside the house. I sat down on a lawn chair. The sun was fierce and I realized I wasn't wearing sunscreen. 10 minutes passed and I began to sweat profusely. Surely she wouldn't mind if I just dipped my toes in. I sat down at the side of the pool and carefully dipped one leg in. It was cold, more so than swimming pools generally are. Considering the weather, this was a welcome anomaly. Without thinking, I slid into the pool entirely. The weather was extremely cold and a shiver ran down my spine. It smelled strange too, like salt. I kicked my legs to stay afloat while I rubbed some warmth into my cold arms. Something touched my foot. Something like seaweed. I tore my leg away, though it got entangled in the stuff. I gave it another, more violent tug, and finally tore it free. Flailing about in a panic, I pulled myself up onto the tiled poolside. Shivering with both cold and fear, I pulled the strange tendrils off of my leg. They were dark and stringy. With a jolt, I realized what it was. Human hair. I looked into the pool. Nothing was there. With disgust, I peeled the slimy strands off my skin and tossed them in the grass. Then she returned with 2 glasses of lemonade. "I thought I told you not to go into the pool." Her voice had a beautiful sing-song quality even when she was mad. Her demeanor softened. She set down the lemonade on the table. "It's okay. If you want to go into the pool now, we can go into the pool." She began climbing into the water. I didn't want to go into the pool anymore, but I also didn't want to be rude. The water was just as cold as ever. She led me to the middle, where it was the deepest. I was never great at swimming, and as I struggled to stay afloat, the water surged into my nose and mouth. It tasted salty, like ocean water. "Let's try to swim down and touch the bottom," she suggested. I didn't like the idea, but I went along with it anyway. I swam down, my lungs burning. Something bumped into me. Despite the stinging, I opened my eyes. A pair of cold, dead eyes stared back at me. I yelped, letting my breath escape in a rush of bubbles. I kept my eyes open as I tore through the water. The water seemed infinite, definitely beyond the proportions of a swimming pool. All around me, dead bodies were suspended and upright under the surface. Some had pieces missing, as though something had been eating them. Something wrapped around my leg, and it definitely wasn't hair this time. I looked down and saw her, unnaturally red lips pulled back in a mocking smile, revealing a row of sharp teeth not unlike those of an anglerfish. I struggled weakly. My vision became blotchy and blurred. I could see the surface above me. Human forms bobbed up and down, dark and shapeless in the infinite water. In one last effort, I kicked as hard as my oxygen-starved muscles would allow. For a moment, her grip slackened and I swam frantically. When I finally broke through the surface, the atmosphere was strangely calm. I heard the hum of lawnmowers in the distance as I desperately sucked air back into my lungs. My arms were shaking as I pulled myself out of the pool. I looked back into the water. Nothing was there. Now, as I'm sitting here writing this, I can still hear her singing her siren song. They live underwater. When I was a kid, I discovered something. It was at my summer home in Lake Placid. I used to head out there every summer with my family and some friends. I loved it there. We owned a huge log cabin full of things that a kid would find amazing. We used to love to go for swims in the lake as the hot sun beat down, fatiguing us. The embrace of the cold, shimmering water was indescribably refreshing. I could swim for hours without becoming exhausted. There was something really special about that place, and I loved it as a kid. We kept going there until I was about 16. That year, something went wrong. It was enough to make my family sell that house we loved so much, and it's something I've never forgotten. And I don't think I ever will. On that day, last year, 1997, I was out for a swim. I was with my dad and my brother. My friends were all out for lunch, and my mum was inside reading. We were just messing around in the lake, splashing each other, seeing who could do the biggest cannonball, and other stuff like that. It was really sunny out that week, and my shoulders were toned crimson. The water was really refreshing and helped cool them down. I remember the way the water rippled, slowly, up and down just a little bit. The cold, soft water would splash up on my face. I pulled myself up onto the dock, its warm wood planks heating my hands. I walked back to the beginning of the dock, and then ran full speed to the edge. I leapt out and felt the wind blowing against me as I flew through the air. My dad and my brother were in the water below me. I fell into the water and let myself slowly drift to the bottom. The water slowly became colder as I fell, and it quickly lost that same nice, refreshing, peaceful feeling. It now felt dark and dangerous, and it made me feel uncomfortable. I opened my eyes underwater and saw what I thought was rays of light from the sun, but now I know it was otherwise. I stayed there for another moment, but quickly came up for air when I got a bit scared. As I came up, my dad and brother were on the dock, Nokia satellite phone in hand. I emerged and splashed them, laughing. They turned, and my dad set his phone down slowly. He pulled me up out of the water and brought me into his arms. "I thought I'd lost you," he said in tears. I was confused, to say the least. "What do you mean, Dad?" I asked. "I was just under for a few seconds." "Well, you were down there for 14 minutes. Understandably, I was a bit scared. We didn't swim anymore that week, but we did decide to the following week. Everyone was there that time. My whole family and a couple of families we're friends with. I brought goggles because we all planned on going for a swim out to the platform in the middle of the lake. We got there and I rushed to jump in. The nice, familiar embrace of the water there as usual. Everyone else joined me and the laughs quickly filled the air. Water flew through the air as people splashed and dove through. My brother ran up the dock and slipped at the end, causing everyone to laugh. We eventually decided to head out to the platform. We all grouped up and swam over. I was a really strong swimmer back then and on the swim team. However, as everyone was swimming, I found myself slowly falling to the back. I wanted to speak up and ask them to slow down, but I couldn't manage. I was so exhausted and could barely stay above the water. I quickly ran out of energy, and it felt like a million little hands slowly pulled me under. I grabbed and clawed at the water, but couldn't help it as I submerged. I got the same uneasy, scared feeling as I slowly drifted down to the lake floor. My eyes were greeted by the same beautiful sparkles, although now that I had the goggles, I could tell that they weren't sunlight. They were little bugs. They were all buzzing around something. I looked down at my leg and saw that these little bugs had pulled me underwater. The lights, they were entrancing. I needed air, but I had to go to the light. I swam towards them, the bugs letting me go. I reached out for them and they all moved to the side. They revealed a beautiful woman with green skin. She appeared like a mermaid, but without the tail. More women like her slowly crept up from the dark depths of the lake, and they approached me. Suddenly, they grabbed me and started trying to catch my limbs with their teeth. I yanked myself away, snapping out of my trance. I clawed to get to the surface with desperation, and my hands found something. I pulled myself up on the rope and emerged. Police boats surrounded me, and my distressed family sat upon the platform. They all yelled in delight and looked very relieved. I looked back down and caught a glimpse of hair slowly drifting down to the depths. I had been underwater without air for 3 hours, longer than any human before by a long shot. I haven't ever seen those lights again, but I know that if I did, I would swim to their beauty in seconds. Confessions of a deep sea diver. I recently left my job as a deep sea diver. I worked for a large company that offers diving services that range from salvage, underwater demolition, ship repairs, and search and recovery. They're a reputable company and are considered safe and reliable. So much so that they are often contracted by the government. Truth be told, I'll miss working for them. The people I worked with were the best of the best, but there are only so many unexplainable things you can witness in the deep before you decide to stay out of the ocean forever. Here are some examples of the secrets many divers take to their graves. On the way to a job we were contracted to perform, our propeller became fouled. I suited up and prepared to make a quick dive to remove the fouling. I did a brief inspection and located thick line wrapped around the prop and shaft. I notified the supervisor, who then lowered a canvas bag with the tools I needed to cut it off. I hung the bag from the shaft and began freeing the propeller. It didn't take long, and I returned to my tool bag. I noticed a strange crunching sound when I dropped the tools in the bag. When I looked in the bag, it was full of large shells, many of which I had just crushed. After getting out of the water and stripping off my gear, I began examining them. The shells had what appeared to be hieroglyphics etched into them. I learned from one of the senior guys that this wasn't common, but had happened to several of them before. On one other occasion, we were recovering a military aircraft. When we arrived, naval ships were on the scene, waiting for us to recover it for them. We were quickly briefed that they had lost communication with the pilot and wanted us to recover it so that they could investigate. I was sitting in comms and logs, where we communicate with divers and monitor depth and bottom time, when the divers reached the project. They reported that the plane was still intact. We were all surprised. The supervisor asked how extensive the damage was, and they explained that it was completely intact, as in there was no visible damage at all. It was just resting on the bottom. Even stranger, the aircraft canopy was still in place. That means that the cockpit is still sealed. In other words, the pilot did not eject. But there was no sign of the pilot. We recovered the plane and the military took custody of it. We never heard about it again. I witnessed another strange occurrence from topside at the location of a planned demolition. It's necessary to explain that one way you can keep track of a diver is to watch their bubble stream. When a diver inhales, the helmet's demand regulator provides air from their umbilical. Then, when they exhale, it is exhausted into the water and floats up to the surface. On topside, you can watch the bubbles and get a sense of where the divers are. Now, on this occasion, we were hundreds of miles from land and had placed 2 divers in the water. About an hour into the dive, we started noticing something strange was happening. There were 3 distinct bubble streams coming from where they were working. At first, we assumed that there was a current and it was affecting them, but soon we noticed a 4th set of bubbles coming from a distance. It stopped about 20 feet from the divers, near the other mysterious bubbles. We asked the divers, but neither of them could see anything out of the ordinary. Then, even from the surface, we heard a blood-curdling screech from the waters. Then silence. The divers weren't too concerned. We hear strange things all the time. Sound travels well in the water, and you learn to assume it was just a long distance away. But soon, it looked like the water in the distance was boiling, and it was getting closer. It wasn't boiling though. It was countless new bubble streams moving nearer to the location that our divers were working. The supervisor ordered the divers to get onto the dive stage to be lifted back to the surface. The bubbles were frighteningly close now, and the divers being lifted out said they had begun seeing shadowed figures in the distance. They couldn't quite make out what they were though. We elected to pull the divers out without completing their decompression stops and throw them into our hyperbaric chamber. During another dive in the Bahamas, I had a frightening experience. It was my first salvage job with them, so I got in with a highly experienced diver. At just over 200 feet deep, we were examining the sunken vessel for rigging points. As I approached the bow of the ship, I noticed he was investigating a damaged portion of the hull. He swam a few feet into the ship, looking around. I asked him a few times if he wanted me to tend to his umbilical, the air supply hose, from just outside the ship. It's highly advisable since it's dangerous to enter a sunken ship, to which he stated no. He didn't want to enter the ship. He insisted he was on the port side of the ship. Assuming he was disoriented, I reached in to grab him. Just before touching him, I realized that there were no bubbles coming from the helmet. Whatever this was, it wasn't breathing. I backed up and reported that there was something else down there. I expected mockery, but there was none. The next thing I heard was the diving supervisor. Both divers square yourselves away and get ready to leave the bottom. When I heard back on surface, I asked the supervisor about it. He said he refused to put his divers in exceptionally dangerous situations. He then refused to clarify. We declined to complete the salvage. I'm not entirely sure how to explain this next dive. I was on bottom, laying on my back, staring up towards the surface. All I could see were varying shades of darkness. Suddenly, I came to my senses. I had no memory of how I got here. I realized I couldn't remember getting into the water, or even why I was here. I tried to will my body to stand up, but I realized I couldn't move. I couldn't control my own body. Over the comms, I could hear topside instructing the other diver to find me. How long had I been down here? How long had I been missing? He told Topside that they grabbed him. I tried to shout out, but I couldn't even do that. After a few frantic minutes of communication between the diver and Topside, I noticed a shadow growing clear. It was moving toward me. Topside, I've found him. He reached down and grabbed my harness to drag me back to our dive stage. As he pulled me, I rolled over and got a brief glance at my surroundings. I had been laying in a pile of human bones. One of the strangest things I've ever witnessed happened on a body recovery mission. Even I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't been the one in the water. The military had found a site in which they believed the bodies of several missing World War II sailors would be found. I entered the water with another diver, with body bags to carry the remains. On bottom, we eventually found 3 skeletons. We placed them in the bags and returned to the stage. On our return trip to the surface, we saw the bags begin to move. At first very slightly, then violently shaking and rolling. Bubbles escaped from 2 of the bags, and then they went still. The 3rd bag continued struggling. We reached the surface and sat down on the deck, stripping our gear immediately. We were afraid to touch the bags, but one of the tenders eventually unzipped the moving bag. An old, frail, very alive man rolled out, coughing water. We stood, shocked, unable to comprehend what we were witnessing. Still not sure what I was doing, I ran to the other 2 bags and unzipped them. There were 2 more old men laying motionless in the bags. They appeared to have just drowned. We attempted CPR, but we were unable to revive the men. The man, who was somehow now alive, was backing away from us, screaming of the horrors he'd witnessed. He screamed about an eternity spent burning. We locked him in a room and contacted the military that we had found a survivor. Within the hour, a military chopper was hovering over us to pick up the 2 bodies and the survivor. We had placed the bodies back in their bags and handed them over. The man bent over to inspect them, unzipping the bags. As he opened the bags, an unbearable stench overtook us. The bodies appeared to be in decay, as if they'd been dead and soaking in the water for a week. He zipped it back up and had them lifted into the chopper. Then we escorted him to the survivor. We could hear the screaming from down the hall. We opened the door and saw blood splattered on the walls. He was alive and screaming, but he too appeared to have started decaying. The man calmly walked into the chopper, and the 2 of them were lifted on board. We never heard about them again. However, I went back and examined the room. With his blood, he had drawn hieroglyphics on the walls. I'm still not certain of what I viewed, but there are a few things that seem to stand out. Waves, flames, and bodies. There was a tremendous amount of them on the walls, but shortly after I walked in, our supervisor began scrubbing them. He refused to let us examine it any further. I've heard rumors about the Keepers of the Deep. I wondered about them for quite some time. I believe they are the link between many of our stories. Their myth within our team is seldom spoken of, but here is what I gathered over the years. We are not meant to roam the depths of the ocean, and when a diver loses his life in the deep, it doesn't stay that way. They are cursed to forever roam the oceans, and when they find the living, in an envious rage, they will bring you back to the depths from which they came. While working on an oil rig, we were utilizing an ROV, imagine a small remote control submarine, to do inspections. We'd been hired to inspect for structural damage or deficiencies after the rig had complained of abnormal vibrations. During operations, the ROV is attended to from a line that offers power, a strength member, and transfers video and sonar images back to topside. As the ROV descended into darkness below, we began to notice thin scratches along the structure. At first, it was barely enough to rip the marine growth off the metal, but as we got deeper, the scratches turned to gouges. As we descended even deeper, we began to notice that the scratches appeared deliberate. We pulled the ROV up close to inspect. There, before us, were images. There were hieroglyphics carved into the metal. and they were fresh. The deeper we got, the older the carvings appeared. They were corroded and partially covered in growth. Whatever was making these carvings was working its way up from the bottom. Then the ROV stopped responding. It began shaking back and forth, and we lost power to it. We tried to pull it up by its tending line, but it seemed stuck. Then we felt it, tugging against the line, but it was coming from the ROV's side. Something was pulling it deeper. 2 more guys jumped onto the line and struggled to pull it back up. The line began creaking and parted. We pulled up the remainder of the line, but that ROV was gone forever. The supervisor was then left with the task of figuring out how to report our findings to the oil company. Another incident took place about a year ago. During a salvage job, we were in the process of installing the rigging gear. While facing the ship with my back to the open ocean, I hadn't noticed anything approaching. Suddenly, something smashed into the tank behind my back. Hard. I was slammed into the ship, flattened against it by the force. I turned around and there was nothing. I would later learn that I had several bruised ribs from the impact. After reporting to the diver and topside, we were told that they were going to pull us. We got back onto the stage and started being lifted towards the surface. We kept our eyes peeled, scanning into the not too distant shadows. During a decompression stop, we began seeing a shadowy figure circling around us. We continued to monitor as it circled closer and closer, and we began to see it more clearly. There was a massive shark circling us. Now, I've never been afraid of sharks, but there's something about being circled by a massive shark in the middle of the ocean dangling from a chain that can instill a new phobia even in the bravest of men. Keep in mind, we aren't in an enclosed cage, just a platform to stand on. It felt like being served on a platter. It eventually circled close enough to see its features, but I didn't recognize the species. It was bigger than a great white, and with entirely different coloration. It was mostly black with a few grey features. It continued eyeing us as we sat there helpless, praying to be left alone. By the time we completed our decompression requirements, it was nearly close enough to touch. The stage lifted us up and out of the water, relieved that the shark had not decided to find out how we taste. On surface, we deduced that the shark had lunged at my back, but had only managed to hit the emergency gas supply cylinder. We did another dive, this time in crystal clear waters. And there's something nice about getting a job in waters where you can actually see your surroundings. The visibility was over 100 feet. We got to the bottom and began work. There were 2 missiles that had been ejected from a military aircraft and had not detonated. We were briefed on their location and told they were not armed and would not detonate provided they were handled appropriately. We located them much easier than we expected and began preparing to rig them up. Just as I laid my hands on the first missile, my dive buddy swore. My stomach dropped. I don't care how many times you've worked with ordnance, I sincerely believe you will always have that uncomfortable sensation in your gut and nervousness in the back of your mind. I looked up and realized he wasn't talking about the missile. He saw a wall of sand rising in the distance. Something, hopefully just the current, was kicking up the sand from the bottom of the ocean. The wall of sand was growing and was about 30 feet tall. Even worse, it was approaching us. Soon it was upon us. It's hard to describe what bad visibility does in the water. It's not a matter of not having enough light, it's a matter of too much crap in the water blocking out the light. Imagine a fog, but imagine, if you can, that this fog is thicker than anything you have ever witnessed. I'm talking about fog so thick that you could have a flashlight pointed at your eyes from an inch away, but you are completely blind to it. That's what bad visibility is in the water. The moment the sand hit us, we were engulfed in pure darkness. I placed my hand against my faceplate, but couldn't even see it. After a few moments, we began hearing a metallic scraping sound. Then, as swiftly as it had arrived, the sand was gone. We had crystal clear waters again, except that there was no sign of the missiles. I had been within arm's reach when the wall of sand hit us, but now even feeling around under the sand revealed no trace of them. The next incident occurred during a humanitarian job that we volunteered to perform. After a portion of bridge collapsed over 50-foot deep ocean waters, we volunteered to recover the vehicles and hopefully the bodies. By the time we arrived on scene, the collapse had taken place just over a week ago. We spent the first day surveying the area and developing a plan to lift the most we could in the week timeframe we had available. By the start of day 2, we were actively pulling vehicles off the bottom. It was a difficult job, to say the least, but not because of the effort required. The state of disarray in the cars was heartbreaking. These weren't military pilots or sailors lost at sea. These were families on vacation or people commuting to work. It was hard to say what was harder, the cars where we found an entire family, with the parents' seatbelts unbuckled and them in the back seat having been trying to unbuckle the children, or the cars where the parents got out, leaving the children buckled in the back seat. I tried not to imagine the panic that had been going on inside the cars as they flooded from broken windshields or windows as people frantically tried to escape, but I couldn't forgive those that left their family to drown. Each day we moved to a new section of cars, and on the 4th day we started noticing several of the cars had their doors open and nobody inside. We were happy to find easier work, especially under the assumption that the tragedy had been lessened by people escaping the wrecks. That is, until I began rigging a minivan for removal. The family inside hadn't been so lucky. As I ran slings through the van and prepared it to be lifted, I noticed the other diver inspecting the rigging gear. He began undoing one of my shackles. I asked what he was doing and the response was not what I'd hoped for. "I'm checking this truck for bodies." I felt the familiar sick in my gut sensation. Slowly, I crept over to the diver and turned his body toward me. It resisted, but slowly turned its face toward me. Its faceplate was fogged up, and I fought my better judgment. I leaned in close, and I wish to this day I hadn't. It was dark, but I could all too clearly make out the features, rotting flesh. The person wearing this helmet had long since passed away. I lost my confidence, starting to scream. My comms were blazing, divers and topside were frantically trying to get my attention, but I was focused on one thing only. I was scrambling backward away from him, but I had fouled my umbilical around the rigging gear in my state of panic. The thing had again returned its focus to the minivan. As I frantically cleared myself from the slings, I noticed the telltale lack of bubbles coming from the helmet. It was opening the minivan door and reaching inside. And as I swam away from the minivan, I watched it grab one of the passengers and drag them into darkness. This was when I began to realize I might not be cut out for working beneath the seas. I continued diving for longer than I knew I should. The entire time, the thought lingering in the back of my mind, I need to get a safer career.